Hello again. So I am very pleased to be able to introduce our first keynote speaker of the conference. I'm going to introduce Latanya Sweeney, who is a professor of government and technology in residence at Harvard University. I imagine she is someone who is very familiar to people in this room. When I invited Latanya, I actually explained that I think she is one of the main inspirations for why this field even exists. So it is really quite a privilege to have her here. Latanya also has the role of director and founder of the Data Privacy Lab. She served as one of the chief technology officers at the Federal Trade Commission. Her work has been instrumental in informing a number of regulations and laws, including HIPAA. Many people will be familiar with the work she has done around re-identification, which informed those laws. She is the recipient of countless prestigious awards, but as I mentioned, I think the thing that really matters probably most to us here is that she's just sort of led the way in showing the kinds of questions and problems that we as a community can be addressing. And so it really gives me a great privilege and pleasure to be able to introduce you to you today, and I'll invite her up right now. So thanks very much.
It's such a, oh wow, it's a really different view from up here. You guys look great. It's wonderful. I'm really grateful to be here. When Salon told me about this conference, sometimes you look at a schedule and you're like, that's gonna be impossible. And I was like, oh, it's gotta be possible. It has to happen. This is just too spectacular an event. And I'm just so grateful that he invited me and that I'm able to come here, and I'm really fantastic. It's just a beautiful view. We should actually get a picture. Here, let me just really start out here with just you gotta see this. We're gonna put this probably up on the website, but you have just gotta see the first, that's awesome. That's just totally awesome. So my job is to kickstart, Salon did give me instructions. So my job is to kickstart this conference. This is exciting work. People are coming from different communities, which is very exciting. And so what I'm gonna do is kind of try to level set everyone and get us going. And let me start by getting my computer to work. I don't know why. You never know, I'm a computer scientist. Why is this not working? Ugh. All right, so when all else fails, we reboot. Sorry. Well, I think I am gonna have to reboot. So while we wait for that, so let me just point out, Salon said that when you're a speaker, make sure you get here early so that there's no technical problems so that the conference can move quickly. And so I've demonstrated what not to do. And there is guidance in that. But so, when one of the things that happens in bringing these multiple communities together, and primarily we think about it in terms of sort of technologists and computer science and social science. And if you go back in time and you think about what did a camera look like at the time that, I cannot do two things at once, man. Oh, this is really hard. I'm almost there. What did a camera look like at the time American jurisprudence was trying to decide what would be the rules that we live by with respect to photographing people in public? And the decision turned out that maybe I have slides now. Yeah, I think it's working. Oh man, like how many and all the messages here, right? Do not install. Oh, what happened? That was a... What in the world? All right. Guys, now I don't know if this is gonna mess up their video filming, but I'd like to walk a little bit. Anyway, this is what a camera looked like when American jurisprudence was trying to figure out what would be the rules to live by in terms of photographing people in public. And it was decided you could photograph people without their permission. And this is what a telephone looked like. At the time, America was trying to decide what were going to be the rules about recording people's conversations. And it was decided that you did need people's consent to record their conversation. And then, you know, especially when I teach younger students, I ask them, what is this? And some of them kind of scratch their heads. But you guys are a little older. We all know that this is a Sony camcorder. When it came to market in the early 1980s, it was the first mass market device that combined video recording with sound. And just by happen chance, the design of it had no mute button. That meant that automatically it was going to put us in the United States at odds with our laws, because, and right away you saw this. People, there was a story of a woman in Pennsylvania who strapped one of these camcorders to her son and to record abuses of a bus driver on his way to and from school. And so sure enough, it works. There were horrible abuses. She takes the film down to the local police department, and they arrest her for illegal wiretapping. There was an incident here in the Boston area where a policeman was arresting a protester. So one of the bystanders pulls out the camcorder and starts recording it. The policeman stops the arrest of the protester, turns around and arrests the other young man who ended up facing a 7-year sentence for wiretapping. Now we fast forward to today. Now Pennsylvania school buses all have cameras on them because they had to change the laws. Now we see it's fine to, you know, thanks to many of the efforts of the ACLU and others, we can record public officials in the service of their duties, and we can post it online and so forth, and no one goes to jail. That's a situation where an arbitrary technology design decision totally forced us to change our laws, forced us to rethink our laws in an unexpected way. Today, technology has this incredible habit of replicating itself. Once a design and business practice works, it gets replicated just as it is. And so today, our mobile phones also allow us to do video recording, and they also have no mute button. It doesn't have to be that way, but the point that I'm making is the design of the technology really does dictate the rules that we have to live by. This is a Sleep Number bed. It's an air mattress that has different chambers. And one of the new features of the Sleep Number bed is this thing called Sleep IQ, which is sensors that lie across the top of the bed that record various things about you, about activity in the bed and things like that. And so in the morning, you can then log in to their server because it exports the data through the internet to their server, and you can see that which they allow you to see about how well you slept. You don't get a copy of the data, and you have no control over who else they may be sharing that data with. This is a different design decision made by the Apple Watch. The Apple Watch is also trying to remind me of how much exercise I get or don't get, but it does so in a slightly different way. The information is stored locally on the phone. And these design decisions have ramifications about our exposure, our vulnerabilities. But I think one thing you can take from all of the examples I've just given you is that we do live in a technocracy, that the design of the technology and how it works is really sort of the new policy. And the thing about these as policy, the designers as policymakers, is we didn't vote for them, we didn't elect them, we didn't have any say in the things that they believe in. But yet, the decisions they make turn out to be the rules that we have to live by. I started my career as a PhD student in computer science wanting to build a thinking machine. In fact, it had been a childhood passion of mine. And back then, AI really was the pursuit of tomorrow's technology. And so I was busy building my thinking machine when I ran into an ethicist who said computers were evil. And I was somewhat dumbfounded. I took the time to see what was rattling her and try to set her straight. And she went on to sort of foresee the future, especially with respect to data and privacy, by saying that the social contract of data was really was being broken, that the idea that data could now be shared widely was a real problem, and I assured her that look at all the benefits. This was health data in particular, and I said, look at all these benefits. You know, look how many lives might be saved, how many new discoveries might come from retrospective research. And she said, well, that's all good and fine as long as no one can be harmed. And she focused on a data set that had come from state employees and their families in Massachusetts that had been sort of shared, was being shared for exactly these kinds of research opportunities. And she said, but look, if you could figure out who the judges are, you could compromise, they could be compromised, or policemen and so forth. And she made very compelling arguments. I tried to reassure her, I'm sure there's no problem there. And, but it turned out that the practice at the time was the way you anonymize data was you just simply removed the name, the address, social security number, and you left everything else and you could give it out widely. So the circle on the left that says data set is an example of the kind of data set, that state data set that was given out. It still had demographics, the full date of birth, month, day, and year, gender, and zip code. So I do a quick calculation in my head. I said, look, there are 365 days in a year. Let's say people live 100 years, and there are 2 genders. That would be 73,000 possible combinations. But I happen to know that there were, at that time, the typical 5-digit zip code only had about 25,000 people. And that meant that people tended to be unique. And so I said, well, let's see if this is right. So I go and I rush down to the City Hall in Cambridge, and I bought the voter list, which came on 2 floppy diskettes. It cost me $20, which is a lot of money back then. William Weld was the governor of Massachusetts. He had collapsed, and the reason and the information around his collapse in public was in that data. And the question I gave myself was, could I figure out which of these records were William Weld's? Well, it turned out only 6 people had his birth date, only 3 of them were men, and he was the only one in the 5-digit zip code that matched those demographics that were found in the database. And we found that these kinds of demographics tend to be unique. The world responded. One day, I'm a graduate student. The next day, I'm testifying before Congress, because that simple data set wasn't just being shared that way with that one data set. That was the standard around the world. And the result of that experiment changed policy around the world. So not only is the work mentioned in the preamble of HIPAA, but also in many other countries as well, and their laws. So this was a great success story in a way. A simple experiment raises the bar for everyone. And that's really the challenge of this group, is to how to expose vulnerabilities and unforeseen consequences of technology and try to raise the bar for everyone. Back then, my vision for AI was I wanted to build a partner, a friend. Not a partner as in love, a partner as in, you know, I wanted to talk, I wanted to learn, I wanted to entertain. What AI has really evolved into, though, is more computing a mathematical ideal, sort of like whatever we say is AI today will be tomorrow's technology. And so as we look through various technologies, at one point we all called them AI, and now we just say, oh, that's just technology that we live by, whether it be Uber and Lyft or self-driving cars, fraud prevention, detecting your credit line, face recognition, and even something like a personal assistant robot. But the need for these simple experiments to still expose these adverse or unforeseen consequences continue. This particular assistant robot is the Amazon Echo. Her code name is Alexa. So if you ask Alexa, if you have one of these, and you go home and you ask Alexa, who is an ape? She will tell you John McCain. So clearly, the unforeseen consequences still continue. So far, I've tried to make the case that we live in a technocracy. I've tried to encourage you to find these unforeseen consequences in a belief that we can raise the bar. Let me tell you another incident that happened in my life. When I first came to the faculty at Harvard, I'd been at Carnegie Mellon for like 10 years. I came to Harvard. I'm in the office, and I'm talking to a reporter, and I need to show him a paper. So I type in my name in Google, and up pops links to the paper. And I tell the reporter, there's the paper we need. He says, forget telling me about that paper. Tell me about these ads that are popping up that imply you have an arrest record. So we sit there, and I'm telling him, well, I've never been arrested, and with a name like Latanya Sweeney, I don't think there's anybody else. And so eventually I pay this money to this company, and I show him that they have no one with my name with an arrest record. So then he says, then why is Google trying to say you have an arrest record? What does Google have against you? So I explained to him, that's not how technology works. It's more neutral. It would cost them too much just to pick on me. And so we go on and on. We begin searching for more names, and we find out, we start to see, sometimes it comes up with arrests. Sometimes it just comes up with, oh, looking for more information, or we have more information, or we've located information. Do you want to learn more about? And sometimes you come up with these ads that insinuated arrests. So Adam Tanner, who's the reporter, is a tall, white, Italian American. And he says, oh, that's because you have one of those black-sounding first names. And I said, what are you talking about, black-sounding first names? And so I try to show Adam how wrong he is, that he doesn't understand anything. But then eventually, in my attempt to show him, I Googled Latanya in image searches. And then I Googled Tanya in image searches, and he's clearly proved his point. So at this point, I did basically just full-fledged research experiment. We did 140,000 ad captures based on typing into a Google search bar the names of real people in the United States, half of them having names given more often to black babies than white babies, and the other half who have a first name given more often to white babies instead of black babies. And we continued to find these arrest ads, even in cases where there was no arrest record, and we continued to find ads that were given neutral ads that didn't imply arrest, where there were people with that name. That's not to say that Christian Lynch was the other. I'm just saying that they had a name that had it. And so when we did the full study, it turned out that, in fact, 80% of the time, you would get an arrest ad if you had a name given more often to black babies than white babies than the other way around. And so how could this be? So the company started screaming and yelling. Google was cool at first until the media picked it up, and then Google was not cool about this. It was no longer an academic exercise for them. So the way Google search engines work, the way the AdWords work, is the company had chosen a title that anytime a particular phrase was entered into the search bar, it would trigger their bid for an ad. And they had put down an ad on every adult American that they knew of, which was pretty much everyone. And they had a price that they would pay if someone clicked on their ad. But then the company claimed that they had really put down sort of the same ads for everyone. That is, they had 5 possible choices. Some of them were neutral, and some of them insinuated the person had an arrest. And they argued that it was the algorithm working with society clicks that made the difference. Why? Because when the algorithm Google wants to maximize its income, so when the algorithm first starts, they're all equally likely to show up. And then as you click on one and Google's making money, it begins to weight which one is going to appear. And so the company's argument was that, gee, that's just society clicking arrest ads more often on black names than on white names. They would click the neutral. But then we fast forward, I get to the FTC, I learned they paid a big fine. So I don't know that really was the truth. In fact, it sort of insinuates something different. And our results insinuate something different about how they had placed the ads. But it still is pretty interesting about the space of possibilities. Was it the ads that they put in? Could it have been an effect from society interacting with the technology? We can dismiss Adam's belief that it was Google picking on me. But still, we always have to think of these 3 things. The other thing that was interesting about this experiment was it was the first time, we actually have a law in the United States, the Civil Rights Act, and this was the first case for which we had shown here in technology, here was an instance of the Civil Rights Act being violated. The Department of Justice had an 80-20 rule. If an incident or an action created an adverse impact on a protected group in a protected setting, that the difference was 80-20, that would usually spawn an investigation. And that was exactly what this experiment had demonstrated, that adverse impact existed. Now, it's not that it's illegal to discriminate in the United States. Discrimination is quite legal. As you can see, I'm getting more gray hair, so pretty soon I'll get my senior citizen discount. And I heard Salon talking about how he was giving money to students to come up here, a kind of student discount and student grants, and we're all for that as well. But in the United States, the Civil Rights Act says that there are certain groups in certain situations that are protected. And one of those groups is blacks, and one of those situations is employment. Because one of the things that happens when you apply for employment is people will search online for information about you. So I use that as an example. I have many more for many other laws in the United States, how technology has really put attention a lot of the laws, how it really is violating or seeming to violate or really sort of undercutting or not allowing us to enforce many of our laws. And so we can have a separate conversation around it, but I think I'll hold out this example that all of our laws are up for grabs. So one way to think about this is just as I said before, it was kind of these four pieces to it. There's the technology itself, and there could be a problem in the technology. It could be the setup or training that came into it that could cause the problem. It could be the interactions, like the clicking, that cause it. But the thing that we know for sure that we have many laws and regulations aimed at are these things that create adverse impacts. They give us a bar, a standard, and the question is, can we show in our experiments that that bar or standard has been met, and therefore others shouldn't intercede. So in terms of other types of setup training, I'll just give a couple of examples. Joy Bolamwini, which took me a while to get her name, her last name, but she's really delightful, and she's here at the conference. She was one of the first to show that the fact that most face recognition software was trained on white male images creates a real problem when trying to recognize the faces of others. And she's done some great experiments like that. I haven't seen Alvaro Bedoya, but he also was the first to point out how on the interaction side, so imagine an algorithm who's just trying to recommend people for a job. At first it sends a diverse group of people, and then the company says, well, these are the people we want to come back. And over time, eventually, and these are the people we definitely don't want, and so over time, the algorithm, if it's smart, will only start sending young people, kind of violating our equal employment law, for example. And so that's an example of the interactions. And of the technology itself, there have been great examples of that too. Unfairness in search pricing, the difficulty getting an Uber or a Lyft during peak times in certain communities, and so forth, are examples of the technology itself. So I encourage you that when we think of in my own work, we think in terms of what's the adverse impact, and that adverse impact could come from either setup, the interactions, or the technology itself. Let me give you another example. When I was at the Federal Trade Commission, for those who don't know about it, is responsible for deceitful practices, ad practices, monopoly practices, and so forth. And because so many of the technology companies are American companies, they in many ways had served as the de facto police department of the internet. So when I was there, I was interested, we did lots of these experiments and they were quite powerful. I'd like to just share with you sort of an infrastructure that led to some of them. We created this thing called the exclusivity of an index, of a domain. Because one of the things that happens in the FTC is fraud detection is theirs. And fraud detection was at that time a chase them down game. So people would complain, I'm losing money. And the kind of money we're talking about is the kind of money where you're willing to write over every penny in your checking account. It's not the spam kind of thing. It's somebody who you trusted who's willing to give a lot of money. And a lot of these interactions are happening online. And so when they were happening online, how do they get to them? Because the FTC wouldn't take an action until the number of complaints got really loud. And when the number of complaints got really loud and they go to try to track it down, the fraudster's long gone. And so it was somewhat ineffective. And so we took a posture that was a little different. We said, well, can we predict where they're going to be? Because one thing about it is these frauds, these really big frauds happen in those spaces where you trust the community the most. So where is it online that people tend to trust? And so, we came up with the idea of the exclusivity index. It's basically the percentage of members of a group divided by the sum of all the comparable groups. So for example, the exclusivity index for Latino households who visit Univision is 0.89. That means a higher percentage of Latino households visit Univision than do any of the other groups. And the closer that number is to 1, the more exclusive that website is. So I think intuitively it kind of fits easily. This is a division between the kind of websites people go to with children versus the websites people go to without children, and it's like a total divide. We looked at whenever a domain came 2 standard deviations above that, we would say that's an exclusive domain we would like to look at. So this is sort of what they look like for children, and that makes total sense. We also did it for all kinds of groups, income, education, race as well. And so this is sort of what some of the most exclusive groups for race look like. So India Times and Yoku.com make perfect sense for Asian. Univision we talked about for Latino. World Star Hip Hop and Foot Locker. So Foot Locker has this unusual characteristic that a higher percentage of blacks visit Foot Locker than do any other group. And that's kind of really interesting. The importance of these domains, though, have been really more powerful in lots of experiments, because the more exclusive the domain, the more likely you'll trust the messaging that's there. And the more you'll trust the messaging that's there, the easier it is to either defraud you, or in more modern times with bots, is to manipulate you. So that was just our fraud work, and we were able to support it. But we've been replicating some of this work on social media platforms and been able to show that some of the strongest influences are in those areas, again, who are more exclusive. And so again, we see the same kind of issue. In 2016, we were able to also show something similar with election bots. Not so much on the influence, but on the ability to impersonate individuals and alter their online voter registration. And that we reported that vulnerability in 36 different websites. So in a way, by changing their voter registration, disenfranchising them from voting. So I use those examples to say that these environments that are trusted the most allow us source for manipulation. And it forces us to think about the same kind of things that we're talking about, whether it was privacy 10 years ago or 20 years ago, okay, I'm getting old, or whether it's been online ads and algorithms and other technologies coming out, and then to show that the cycle is just continuing. And so as this conference, this is the inaugural event for the conference, I think every year this conference will be following that trail of technology, or at least it's my hope. So what do you do about it now that I've gotten you all depressed? So one of the things I definitely left the FTC with was a sense of empowerment. It was a great experience back then. Wouldn't try it now, but back then it was a lot of fun. And what I realized was that we actually have a lot of groups who are already in the position of helping us. The trick is, how do we get the information they need to them so that they can do the job? How do we shore up our regulations, or how do we help the journalists or the advocates? And so when I left the FTC, we started a new journal called the Journal of Technology Science, and I took a group of students. We had 26 students right after I came out of the FTC. Each did a project on these unforeseen consequences. And you see, you could take undergraduate students and within a 1-semester course, do a profound experiment independently, because that's just how much there is out there, right? So anyway, so I take these 26 students down to the FTC. We bring in regulators. It was supposed to last for 2 hours. We had it set up like a project fair. Students had a poster, they stood by their poster, they would talk about it. The typical regulator was a white male in his 50s. The students were young, they were talking about apps and things that the regulators, even though they were regulating, had never heard of. And it was really electric because the regulators learned things about what was going on out there and the things that they could take immediate action on. And the students were excited because in some ways they had real world impact. that the things that they were doing mattered. And some of their stuff is still being used today by the FTC. Others of their things have been, had other kinds of political and social and business impacts. If you look on technology science, the paper started with the students who went down to DC that year. From there, we've published on Scholars and others. But let me just give you a sense of a couple of those papers. Students had mined out all of the pricing of Princeton Review for their online tutoring service around the United States, because before it would give you a price, you had to tell it your zip code. And what they were able to show was that pricing mattered where you lived. And at scale, you can see that here in the Northeast, we pay the highest price in general. But if you zoom in closely, you'll find out that those communities that have Asians are almost twice as likely to be paying the higher price. Airbnb, who really did respond quite well to this, and in fact now recommends pricing, the students were able to show price differentials between hosts who were Asian in California. It was sort of mirroring a study that had been done similarly here in New York for Black hosts. And like I said, Airbnb was quite responsive. The students have had impact on laws. The work had impact on regulations, on practices, and I think one of the most outstanding one was Iran, whose work on Facebook just went viral. He has a TED Talk on it. And it was basically, for years, Facebook had a known vulnerability, and they had said that's just how it was. And this was in Facebook Messenger. Whenever you send a message, it would leak your GPS location. So he built a browser that allowed you to monitor your friends and friends of friends, all of track their locations based on where they would send a message from Facebook Messenger. It had like 90,000 downloads, and within a week, Facebook fixed it. But I think what really made it go more viral is he had been given a summer job at Facebook, and so when he shows up in Silicon Valley the day before he used to go in for work, he gets a call and they said they rescinded the offer. Don't worry, he got a Facebook, he got a TED Talk, he got a Time magazine article. He did fine. He's doing well, He got a job that paid him twice as much. I mean, he really scored. But I tell you these stories of the student experiences and how the students have had impact because one, it tells us how low-hanging the fruit is. It tells us how it is somewhat easy sometimes to find these unforeseen consequences and to have an impact on the business practice or the regulation and so forth. But I primarily tell you these things because if you came to this conference, this is the space in which you can save the world. Thank you. Do we have time? Huh?
Is it okay if I close your laptop?
Yeah, it's fine. Here.
So I am pleased to be able to invite up someone to join Latanya for a brief conversation before we then open up to a general Q&A. I'm going to invite up Jason Schultz, who's actually a professor of clinical law here at New York University. He's the director, in fact, of the Technology Law and Policy Clinic, which I mentioned earlier is the generous host, really, of this event. Jason actually also is the research lead on law and policy for AI Now, which is a new NYU-based institute that also shares many of the same concerns of the community here in this room. So I'm going to invite Latanya and Jason to have about 10 or 15 minutes of discussion. And the idea here was to pair people who come from slightly different backgrounds to kind of draw out some ideas that are, I think, the kind of productive fruit of these kinds of interdisciplinary exchanges. So I'm going to hand over to Jason, and at some point I'll signal that we'll then open up to general Q&A. So thanks very much.
Great. Can everyone hear me? Well, first, thanks to Latanya for an amazing talk and a kickoff, and to Solon and all the organizers, and thanks to all of you for coming to NYU and to the law school. One of the things that's hardest about being a law professor is getting law students and lawyers to be multidisciplinary, and so the very fact that you're in this building and we're having this conversation, I think, is one of the great steps that we have to make. So, Latanya, so much of your work, you know, as I've followed it, I think you have one of those careers where you have probably more practical experience thinking about how research impacts policy and law and policy. So when you think about regulators or you think about lawmakers or other people. And so, but one of the things I think you also point out is that it's also, many of the kind of examples you gave were not necessarily regulators thinking proactively, but, you know, responding, right, or being reactive. And so, as some of you may know, New York City had, the city council just passed a bill to create a task force, which Mayor de Blasio was supposed to appoint by May 11th, on looking at, across all New York City government, automated decision systems, as they've called it, to think about many of these issues, including explicitly in the bill it says fairness, accountability, and transparency, which I wonder where that came from. And so, you know, I'm wondering if, so, you know, part of the work that I've been doing with AI now is to think about where do you start, right? And as part of an ongoing research effort, we just put out an idea that a lot of people worked on, including Solon and others, about thinking about impact assessments, social impact assessments, enumerating systems, looking at ways for researchers to have meaningful access to the systems, but also input into the decision-making processes. I'm wondering if, you know, if you were to imagine yourself, say, Mayor de Blasio calls you into the office, or appoints you as the chair of a task force like this, or things like that, how do we think about where to begin? If a government or a set of policymakers wants to be proactive here, are there lessons that you've learned that you think you would put sort of up front as priorities for them, or frameworks, or other kinds of ways of thinking, since they're not versed in computer science generally?
Yeah, well, I have both good news and more depressing news. So, look, first of all is another lesson learned from the privacy work is one that says, you know, we show a problem, we come up with an elemental solution, and you create a cycle where people can improve it more. By exposing it, you know, I've had the advantage where 1,000 great minds came after me and came up with much better solutions in data privacy, for example. And that idea of taking an unforeseen consequence, exposing it, and putting the regulation on an environment of improvement. Because I'll use privacy again as an example. Our privacy regulations are, it either is anonymous or it isn't. And the fact that it's not anonymous causes a lot of disruption. There's no idea in our current regulations that say, oh, it's okay to tell me that's wrong. I'll now improve my craft and sort of move us towards adopting better techniques. That translates more generally to your task force to saying that we need to think in a regulatory way or a legal way in which we set a bar that's always conditioned on improvement. And that allows us to move faster and easily when a problem is encountered. What's the review of that problem that someone just quantified, and that we can now move upward, move the standard up. The reason that kind of creating that cycle is very important is because there's a kind of temporal mismatch too. So technology is moving like this, and policy moves like this. It moves really, really slow, right? And so you want to, once you get the turtle to finally get to the stopping place, you need a policy that can keep up with the changes in technology. And so for those reasons, I think that's the kind of thing that I would look at.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, like the feedback loop. And, you know, there's a question whether proactive policy in these kind of areas is going to be fruitful, right? I mean, it might be that we'll need more empirical evidence and experimentation to know where to go. But one of the things I thought was interesting about your privacy example, right? You talked about the social contract, right? You talk about this sort of sense of, well, where is the social contract? Is it also evolving in a set of norms? I think specifically when we think about and talk about machine learning, automated decision systems, AI, it feels to me, at least on some level, like we're not exactly sure what the social contract is and when we're breaking it.
That's because we don't control it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, business practice is controlling it. So you have to understand, the pushback on this always, all the money is on the other side. So the pushback, it's not like your task force gets to sit in isolation
Right.
as if nobody's gonna care what you do until you do it. It doesn't work like that. It works that there's a lot of, if we keep on hitting on privacy, there's tons of money of companies who exploit that data. I mean, there are data analytic companies whose only products are based on being able to make bigger data products by linking and sort of taking advantage of those weaknesses. And so, or said a different way, if I stick on privacy again, using it as a road to how we're now, it's bigger than privacy. But, you know, if we were to take, there are 2,167 privacy laws in the United States. And if the goal of a privacy law is to cover a naked body, they turn out to be little dots that pretty much stack on top of themselves, leaving almost all the body exposed. But if we were to go to the European Union, where they have a sort of a blanket policy, then they cover the entire body completely. So you could say that maybe we should go run to be like them. But the fact that we have such fragmented policy has been a real boom to our technology companies, because it allows them to do things until somebody says they can't. And I often use the example of Mark Zuckerberg, why he could invent Facebook in Cambridge, Mass., but he couldn't do it in Cambridge, England. Because in Cambridge, Massachusetts, he could just decide, you know what, I'm building a platform, people can share this kind of data, and that's how it is. But if he had been in Cambridge, England, he'd have to go get permission. That's personal information, and personal information requires particular oversight. And he was a college student, he probably just wouldn't bother. He'd gone on and done something else. And so this is kind of the relationship that we have with our regulatory legal environment, and also the financial incentives as well. And so that's why I think it becomes incumbent on the regulatory environment to keep having to show evidence to move the bar.
No, I think that's great. So one of the things that's been on my mind a lot with these questions is about power and power differentials, right? So money obviously being one of the main ones, but many different affected communities. We see this now in many of the areas which these systems are being rolled out: criminal justice, education, housing, immigration, other places. A lot of the folks who we're coalitioning with around this task force are people who, there are advocacy groups, and you mentioned them in your talk, right, who work with affected communities, right? So the people in this room obviously are here because they want to help make a difference. The affected communities, and the advocates are obviously concerned. Are there ways in which we should be connecting more strongly and to sort of try to build a power base as best we can, to kind of try to counterbalance this? Or is there a different strategy that you think, or do the strategies go together? I mean, how do the affected communities work with this community? Obviously, some people cross over, but it's, how do we strengthen that connection?
Well, I mean, I think the group that you haven't described at the table are the technologists, or I don't hear you saying, oh, gee whiz, Google's bringing somebody. And I'm not sure you even want Google to bring someone. That's a different kind of question. But the reason I push back a little bit that way is because if I only have the advocacy community, which can be very powerful, then a lot of this community is about giving them the facts that they can use in their discussion. These experiments are like shoring up facts, right? But all you need is for one technology company to take a loss, and that disruption is huge. And so if you're sitting in Silicon Valley, or you're sitting in a technology company, and you've got millions of dollars at play, and you've already decided that your technology works in a certain way, the earlier you could intervene with them, the easier it is for them to make a decision. If you think of the Sony camcorder, if somebody had said to Sony, for less than a penny, if you add a mute button, it would harmonize with the laws in the United States, they probably would have just done it, right? But by the time they're shipping and available at your local store, they're going to fight you rather than think about changing it. And so, and increasingly, we do find the technology companies are trying to figure this stuff out earlier on in an attempt to harmonize. So to whatever extent you think that can help. Now, we need groups at all levels. So if your policy group is not about technology, it's the gatekeepers on the regulatory environment that's going to set the policy of a bar for New York. Then the goal of this community is to provide evidence as to why they should be concerned and what should they be concerned about when the other side pushes back. If you're trying to solve the problem for the United States through your policy, you do have to figure a way to try to interject early into the technology.
No, that's a great question. So, I mean, I think the examples you gave are actually really instructive around where technical interventions are helpful. Do you think there are limits, though? Or do you, like, how would you think about how you evaluate the effectiveness of technical interventions? And when do you say that's as far as the technology can go and we need other interventions like regulatory, political, economic?
Well, I don't think that I do advocate for technical interventions. You know, in my work, you can probably find a pretty much even split between whether or not the solution was a policy change, whether or not there was a new technology that exposed something for a technology, whether there was a technology fix. I guess, you know, like Iran sort of instigated a technology fix, right? Versus was there just a new way to do it? Because one of the things that also is a bit of a myth is that what we call technology isn't actually technology. What we call technology in these discussions is the combination of a technology with a business practice.
Right.
And at the time that we're talking about it, the company refuses to remove the two. Oh, it's the only way it could work. Well, it's not true. It's not the only way it could work. And so sometimes you can reintroduce, if they're not too far along, you might be able to reintroduce a technology as a different business practice.
Yeah, I mean, I like the way in which you often will run these experiments around not just the technology, but the impact of the application of the technology, right, and trying to measure that in particular ways. Because, I mean, from a law and policy point of view, right, I mean, we have our own standards for facts and evidence, and they sometimes match up with other disciplines. And the more and more, I think, in these areas, we're going to have that translation be even tighter. And so these kind of impacts, if they can be measured in a way that is connected to legal rights, yeah, I think that's where you see a lot more traction on the law and policy side, yeah.
And I think this point that you're making is really important for this community because the computer science community, when they're thinking of fairness and so forth, they will often think of it in a mathematical term, which is important for us all to know, but it's important for those computer scientists to know, but that's not where the legal bars are.
It's often not how judges think or other policymakers think. So I'm getting the signal from Solon for Q&A, so we'll welcome him back up. Yeah, this is great. I can look forward to continuing.
Thanks so much, Jason. That last point I thought was especially a great one, Latanya, so thanks for making that. I think that resonates probably with a lot of people in this crowd. So we have some time now at the end for questions from the audience, so please queue up behind the two mics in the aisles here, and I'll happily call on people. So, yeah, and definitely don't be shy. Please.
Hi, never been so intimidated in my life. Thank you so much for the wonderful talk. You presented excellent example where revealing unfairness was transformative. We are constantly facing the new problem that people come up with explanation and they say, well, the unfairness could come from many sources, and of course there's many ways to make that argument. So basically I'm just wondering, do you have any advice on how to address that? Making sure that we are not just getting used to the fact that there are every week a new big stories about unfairness and just accepting it. And also, do you think there's a hope to build tools that will prove that it's possible to certify fairness or have a sort of more proactive, just build the fairness inside? So that's my question.
I think a lot of the work that they're doing at AI now is in that arena. So part of it is a translation. It's a how do I talk? So for example, the ads that I talked about, the Google ads, the important piece beyond us all having a kind of interesting, a wow effect, was the ability to tie it to the Civil Rights Act and the practice that the Department of Justice had. It was that from beginning to end connection that I think really made it have teeth. Does that make sense? And so, and then, because in some ways I would argue that the fairness kinds of objections you get, you know, computer scientists, or social scientists would say, oh, they're just going to hit you with confounders, that there are these confounders. And, you know, and so then you may have to do additional things to prove or disprove the confounders, or can you make the argument irregardless of the confounder? Did that help?
Yeah. Great.
Okay.
Hi. What regulatory provisions would help you and your students and so on reverse engineer systems to understand some of the challenges you found? What's your fantasy provision?
Oh, I am so glad you asked that question, because, you know, he's on a committee who can make a real difference, right? Transparency. Transparency, like if you could only get one thing, it's, oh, well, if this algorithm is going to be used for making these kinds of decisions, then the algorithm and its training data has to be available. That notion of transparency is huge.
So I just want to, actually, the committee has not been appointed yet, but thanks for the endorsement. But I did want to ask, actually, if I could follow up on that too. So there's been some debate about whether there's a one-size-fit-all transparency model, or how to approach the fact that different systems are designed different ways. So training data and the kind of mathematical or design sort of purpose-driven stuff, is there more ways or factors or variables to think about, do you think, in transparency? Or is it, like, how specific do you need to be? Or is it a general model that you apply to every system? Like, how much does context matter, I guess? In the way, like a parks and recreation system versus a criminal justice system is another way that, it's like, is transparency the same for all systems, or does it vary based on context?
Well, that's totally a policy decision, but I mean, wherever you can get the right, wherever you need that cycle of feedback to improve, or wherever you want to know, is it what we think it is? That's where you need a lever, you know, and that's not unusual. So, you know, I would have lawyers think about the Freedom of Information Act and the Public Records Act. So if these algorithms and training data were being done by government agencies, we would just be hitting them with FOIA and public records, and we would know stuff, right? But we don't have the equivalent for companies. So it could be the case that a groundswell happens and we institute the same idea across companies. I don't think the companies will, I don't think the, you know, the Department of Commerce would be endorsing that. But certainly not now. And, but, you know, but could you do it in certain areas, either applications or certain venues, like in that way it kind of looks like the way we do privacy. Oh, well, if you're in health, then we've got this, or if you're in that. And so it may follow something like that. And that may be something that is reachable or attainable.
Hi. Thanks for mentioning the EU regulation on data protection, but I'd like to pass some comment here. And this is extending on Solon's comment that we need an interdisciplinary conversation. We also need a transatlantic conversation. And you said something very interesting there. The fact that you have such fragmentary laws allows US Americans to develop such great technology. I think that's a very dangerous statement without context. First of all, it's not the case that Mark Zuckerberg would not have been allowed to develop his Facebook thing in Cambridge, UK. What some European lawmakers and some European regulators and politicians are now opposing are the abuses of the technology in a certain type of business model. So data processing is allowed, and a lot of personal data processing is allowed. There's just rules. I mean, I feel like Walter Sobchak here. And so I think it's very important to see that there is a dangerous thing in saying we need individual freedom to have great technology, because that needs to be contextualized in technology being part of a business model that is against the rules and that we need to fight. Guys, everybody, data processing of personal data is allowed in the EU. You can, developing great technology is allowed in the EU, and there's a lot to be said for the position that if you have rules, that's going to be an incentive to have great innovation in terms of how you can build technology that actually respects human freedoms.
So-
Thanks.
So let me just kind of gently both say, embrace your comment and at the same time push back a little bit. So first of all, I never said great technology. I just said technology. And I just said American technology. And you said, oh, but there are rules. There are, yeah, they can do data processing, but there are rules. But here were no rules. Still are no rules. There are no rules at all. This is the Wild Wild West. So whenever I need a break, I go to Europe or Canada. No, seriously, I'm serious about that. When I just kind of like need a sanity check. And it's really important, it's really difficult for someone from the EU to appreciate the reality of when I say no rules, I mean like no rules, right? And the other thing is that the EU, is really, many people in the EU, or many parties are trying to say, well, maybe they should be the gatekeeper. That is, as these technologies are becoming international in scope, it's a lot easier for a technology company to have one product than to have a specialized product for the EU, a specialized product for Russia, or a specialized product for China. And so that in some ways the negotiation and the rules that they make may raise the bar for everyone. So that's also an active area.
Hi. I just wanted to say, just to everyone, I work in open source, and I have a resources publication thing on the website about transparency and accountability using open source tools. So find me to talk about that later. But my question actually is, so a lot of the things we've been talking about have been things where you can very more easily measure the effects because we have some sort of shorter term metric. How do you think about the problems that are a more like drip, drip, drip kinds of problems where longer term exposure, I mean, I know a lot of people have been talking about, for example, the effects on children of technology, where there's a disparate impact because there's a duration of exposure. How do we think about those kinds of problems? What sort of solutions can we propose, and how can we even measure these effects if we know that it's going to take a while for us to really know how this is going to affect people?
I mean, I think that, I have a 10-year-old, and it's been fascinating to see. I mean, I just have so many studies I'd love to do in this space of electronics in children, or technology in children. Just everything from apps to the recommendation of apps, moving, to the feedback system that the app uses to kind of push his primal part of his brain to say, I need to stay here. It just goes on and on, the space of studies. But I don't see that necessarily different. Some of these other areas also have that, but I'm so glad you called that out, because that's a great area for work. And then so it's just tons of work in that space possible.
So we'll take one more question.
Hi, my name's Deb. I'm from Clarify. And I had a question kind of based off of the examples that you gave. So two examples in particular kind of highlighted the two dimensions of this problem. So one is kind of your initial research in terms of privacy and looking at the process and really critiquing the process around how people anonymize data. And the second example around when you were receiving biased Google Ads results and understanding that the data was really the source of your vulnerability there. So Clarify is a computer vision AI company, so that's at the core of kind of the debate around machine bias. Is it the data, or is it the algorithm or the process through which we create our models that results in the bias? So I was curious as to, because you've kind of seen both sides, what are your thoughts on where we should be looking at, or where we should be focusing as a community on where bias is introduced? Is it should we be analyzing the training sets and the data that's kind of introducing this bias, as biased data sets usually do? Or should we be critiquing the processes around, the way we obtain the data or the way that we train our models?
I hope that the takeaway is that all of it, that there are times where the bias is in the technology itself, it needs to be examined. There are times when it's the setup or the training, it needs to be examined. There are times when it's neither of those, but it's the interactions. And it could be, I don't have one example, but it could be a combination of them too, could also happen. And all of that has to be fleshed out. And so that's sort of the task, that would be my way of describing the task of this community.
So I hope everyone will join me in thanking Latanya Sweeney again.